Welcome, everybody, to this quarterly meeting of the Citizen Diplomacy International. I'm going to share some information in the Zoom chat about this meeting and about Citizen Diplomacy International. Some of you are already familiar with this stuff, but I'm going to give you that information nonetheless. Let me start by just, though, encouraging you to share information about yourselves. I'm going to put this in the Zoom chat right now. So if you could here, so I'm just introducing myself. I'm the founder and the director of Learning Life, which puts on or has this program called Citizen Diplomacy International. We're a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit that is essentially looking to kind of widen participation in democracy and diplomacy. So if you could, each of you introduce yourselves in the Zoom chat. You'll see here in the notes that I included, please include your name, your city, your country, if you're willing to share your occupation, and if you're also willing, why you're interested in citizen diplomacy, and feel free to cut and paste into the Zoom chat any kind of biographical information or links about you or about programs that you're involved in related to citizen diplomacy. I should note that whatever you share in the Zoom chat is going to be shared out to a broader group of people that are on our CDI list, Citizen Diplomacy International list. And this meeting, as you might have noticed, is recorded. I'm also going to share right now a little bit of information about CDI, so to the Zoom chat. If you would like that information, it's there. You might have seen this already, but we're nonetheless kind of sharing out all the information and the links. If you'd like to, for instance, join our Facebook group or our LinkedIn group so that you can post. Oh, that message is too long, so hold on a second. So there's that. And this. So if you would like to join our Facebook group or our LinkedIn group, they're indicated right there, and that gives you the opportunity to share out announcements of citizen diplomacy events, articles, books, et cetera, and so forth that you'd like to share. I would like to note also that we have a list of past and all of our recordings of CDI meetings are online on YouTube. So you've got a link there if you'd like to see prior meetings. And lastly, if you'd like more information about our democracy and diplomacy community, which essentially is kind of the overarching community for our organization that encompasses both our diplomacy and our democracy programs. You're welcome to click that link to learn more and to join the DDC, or the Democracy and Diplomacy Community. I think that's it for this. Let me note again, the meeting is recorded and we'll be taking photos during the meeting, or screenshots, to be able to share out to a broader audience. We'll be also sharing out the speaker presentations, the CD Bulletin, the Citizen Diplomacy Bulletin, which you're going to learn about at the end of this meeting, that Brian Smith will be presenting. Last thing is that your active participation is greatly appreciated. While the presenters are speaking, I encourage you to post in the Zoom chat any questions that you might have for them in preparation for our discussion, and any comments that you have as well. And again, those things will be shared out to a broader audience after the meeting. Okay, Without further ado, I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers, but our speakers are also welcome to say a little bit more about themselves. Cesar Corona is going to be speaking first. Each of our speakers will have 10 minutes. And Cesar is the executive director of this Expo Museum, which you're going to learn about in a moment. He's also the assistant director of the Center on Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles in the USA. Then following him will be Federica Busa. I don't know if I've just butchered your name, but I'm going with this kind of Spanish pronunciation of what I assume is your Italian name. So Federica is, I believe, joining us from the United Arab Emirates. Is that right? Okay.
Correct, from Dubai.
Great. And Federica is a partner with Busa Woodward that does experience design, and she's the former senior vice president for Expo 2020 Dubai, focused, as far as I know, on the actual visitor experience. And last of our speakers is Mark Ritchie, who is the co-founder of Minnesota USA Expo 2031 and the former Minnesota Secretary of State in Minnesota in the United States. So Cesar, you're first.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen, and I just posted my bio on the chat. So can you confirm you're seeing it?
Yep.
Screen. Perfect. So well, first of all, let me thank you, Paul. Thank Learning Life, and particularly the Citizen Diplomacy International Program for this kind of invitation. And I want to say it's an honor to be here with Federica and Mark, whose work in Expos I truly admire and respect. My presentation is called Expos as Diplomatic Mega Events. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a brief history of Expos and to explain how they became the diplomatic mega events they are today. So hopefully I can go through this fast. It's a long history, but I'll try to be brief, and maybe we can talk more during the questions and answers session. So let me start with 18th and 19th centuries. France and the United Kingdom at that point encouraged the access of wider sectors of the population to arts and sciences. This was a time when not everyone had access. Art collections were mostly private. Knowledge was mostly kept for those who had resources, who had access to higher education institutions or to some elite centers. So arts and sciences were presented to this wider population, but particularly in relation to industry and trade. So in the United Kingdom, we had the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce. We had the Mechanics Institutes, mostly focusing on training and techniques and industry, but also thinking about how arts could inspire innovation. France, starting in 1798 all the way to 1849, had 11 national exhibitions with a more clear goal of telling the French population that their industry was strong, helping share ideas so that they would learn techniques, they would improve their quality, they would create new things that would benefit their trade and their industry. So altogether, France and the UK exposed the general public to new ideas, to education, to improve trade, but basically to improve creativity. So I say this in 3 words: it's inspiration for innovation. I think that continues to happen today. I have to clarify something. I hear frequently that expos are presented as places where people are exposed to inventions, and sometimes that's presented as the ends of an expo. It's actually the means. Inventions are there for people to learn, to get inspired, to get motivated. So really want to highlight the educational purpose of expos. 1849 was the 11th National Exhibition in France. And Henry Cole, a British civil servant and inventor, and very close to Prince Albert, heard that the French were thinking about inviting other countries to their exhibition to get other ideas, expose their population to foreign ideas. However, France was hesitant and they decided not to do it. However, Henry Cole took the idea to Prince Albert, and for the exhibition planned for 1851 in London, they decided to invite other countries. So that's what we know as the first expo. This was the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations. And here we have a few images. Expos after this became popular, but too popular. So some of the problems we saw, countries were having trouble participating in expos because they are costly, their quality decreased. Sometimes countries were invited, and when they agreed to participate and dedicate some resources, they learned that this wasn't a government expo, it was a private exhibition. So there was a need to be clear about through diplomatic channels that this was an official exhibition. There were efforts to regulate expos. The first strong one happened in Berlin in 1912. There was a document created, the Diplomatic Conference Relating to International Exhibitions, which established a good part of the terminology we continue to use today. However, that convention was never ratified. The World War I happened, and it couldn't be finalized. However, France retook the idea, and in 1928, there was a convention conference of governments, which created the Convention Relating to International Exhibitions, which regulates expos to this day. So there were 11 founding countries that joined the exhibition, the convention. And among the things that this convention created was the BIE, the Bureau International des Expositions, or International Exhibitions Bureau, as it's called in the English version of the convention. This is a diplomatic entity that works very much like the UN. National governments send their delegates. Each government has one vote in choosing next exhibitions. Their delegates are duly accredited to this organization. The convention also established the purpose of the expos, that they cannot be essentially commercial, and that their purpose is the main purpose is the education of the public. To this day, 183 countries are members of the BIE. And since its creation, well, it's the first expo the BIE regulated happened in 1935. And since then, the BIE has overseen 48 expos, and there are 3 scheduled for the next few years. And here, I just wanted to show you the official definition of an expo. They are called international exhibitions in the convention. And as you can see, their principal purpose is the education of the public. I'm going to keep it brief because I mean, there's more details to this, but we can discuss that later. One important thing to mention, the BIE, compared to other mega events institutions, the BIE is a public institution, it's intergovernmental. It's comprised by governments who signed an international treaty. FIFA and the International Olympic Committee are private organizations. So this is very important because we as citizens have a say somehow in what the BIE does through our governments. We cannot do basically anything through FIFA or the IOC. There are several types of diplomacy happening in expos. I'm just showing this briefly. This is a sort of taxonomy of diplomacy. But you have summit diplomacy, it's frequent, it's common for presidents, well, heads of state, heads of government, ministers of foreign affairs to attend expos. But also, as I mentioned, the BIE is an intergovernmental organization with diplomats. So it's a multilateral forum. Invitations and confirmations to participate are only sent through diplomatic channels. And there are probably the most important part for me to highlight in this presentation is the role of commissioners or commissioners general. These people are accredited by their governments to represent everything they do in the expo during the preparation and during the duration of the expo. So under a summit diplomacy scheme. So everything that happens under a national section, national pavilion, has to be responsibility of the Commissioner General, controlled by the Commissioner General. So that interaction with the public is a message controlled by the Commissioner General, I mean, government through him, but then through different channels delivered to the public. Really quickly, I have some, I will share this presentation with all of you so you can see some of the examples. It's a confirmation of participation through diplomatic channels. Here, Matteo Renzi, Prime Minister of Italy, with Presidents Evo Morales of Bolivia, Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia in Expo 2015 Milan. Here, Secretary of State John Kerry introducing Ambassador Hickey as Commissioner General of the US Pavilion in Milan. And all of that, I mean, there's a complex diplomatic system happening behind the expos, but in the end, experience for the public is very unique, and they don't see all this work happening. They see architecture, they see cultural events, they see exhibits, they touch exhibits, they experience exhibits, they talk to hosting staff, try food, buy souvenirs, and attend official events. But expos are an event for the public, an event for education, an experiential event. And I invite you as citizens to attend an expo if you can, and also to get involved and to have a say in what your governments communicate in expos through your governments. So I want to finish here. Here's my email address, and I'm available for any questions and happy to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Awesome, Cesar. Thank you for keeping to the time. Federica, you're next. Oh, you're muted. You need to unmute.
There you go. I always have problem with the mute button. Very nice to meet everybody. I'm going to share my screen, and I guess that when I put it in full screen mode, I'm not going to see anybody. So it's I've also put my bio in the chat, and thank you, Cesar. You made a great premise to what I'm going to talk about, which is really then how the citizen diplomacy that Cesar has talked about is actually brought to life within an expo. And in fact, expos are first and foremost about shaping the view of all of the visitors through the many different ways in which they are experienced. And I wanted, just like Cesar started with London 1851, which has been the great innovation, I just wanted to put just an extract from an article at that time, just to share how big the scale of World Expo is, because there are places of massive scales. You talk about millions of visitors, multiple months in which these events take place. And at the time, London 1851 was a very bold and innovative medium to explain to the public the changes that they were seeing across the country with the Industrial Revolution, and was a way to bring the public along and start to learn and understand what was happening. And it was also a time when newspapers became part of the everyday life. So this is just a short premise to say how important expos are to communicate something to the public. And what I want to start talking about is also what is going to be that something that we're going to talk about. But before we do, I just want to tell you what the foundation of an expo is when we're building diplomacy. What's important, and then I'm going to go quickly because I have the details. But first of all, it's where the expo is taking place. The city, the host nation, it's fundamental to that story with the citizens, the time, the historical moment, the participation, who are we talking to and who's doing the talking? What are we talking about? And there's a strong emphasis on content that increasingly it's become about a central theme, because expos from 1851, which were really about the products, the innovations from different countries from around the world, which was really the product of the Industrial Revolution, have increasingly become less about products and innovation and much more about ideas and impact. And we'll see what areas are those, the areas of impact. And finally, why. And that why of why a country will host an expo is really critical in terms of the kind of legacy that they will be building. So in creating the expo experience, connecting culture, a historical moment that often is a moment of celebration, with the engagement of everybody that is participating around a particular theme to leave an impact in the minds and hearts of the citizens way beyond an expo. That's the core of the experience. And a very good expo is one that's capable to connect all of them. And I want to start with a purpose, because my experience, I worked at the BIE before, I studied expo because it was part of my job, but they're really mirrors of society at moment of transitions, and transitions that are shaped by disruptions. And the big disruptor at the beginning was the Industrial Revolution. In the 50s, it was the Cold War and the global tension and the race to space. And increasingly, they're centered around existential threats to humanity. Today, more and more around sustainability and climate change. And let's see what happens in 2030 and beyond. The most important thing is that expos are a communication medium. And we think about internet, we think about newspapers, we think about all sorts of communication media. They are a physical place where people come together for 6 months, talk in the big expo. There's also the smaller expo, but they use the language of art, design, and technology to talk about the big challenges of the world and what governments are doing. Let me talk a little bit about the host and the importance of the countries and what the country that hosts the expo is trying to do in terms of citizens diplomacy. Because the expo, as Cesar said, they're fundamentally about nations. In the case of the Olympics, they're very much driven by the city. In the case of expo, they're driven about the country, and the city happens to be the place where it is hosted. In that city, the citizens are super important because their buy-in into the expo, which tends to have citywide impact, it's essential. Not only because the citizens will be the one that have to bear the pain of the construction, but also get the benefit from the economic impact, from the social impact. And they will enable that expo to be successful through volunteering, through visitation, and through business. And finally, it's a place where that culture, the culture of the place, is creating that identity that becomes a way to communicate national culture and project it onto the world. So this is really the host, and every city and every nation at a particular time has a different reason to host. For China, it was about celebrating opening up. For the UAE, it was in conjunction with the 50th anniversary, and it was more about global branding. It was a very small country, the UAE very young, that was trying to have global impact. And you can see now increasingly the UAE at the table of negotiation. And after that, there was the hosting of COP28, which means that role of becoming a player was also facilitated through the expo. And Saudi is also talking about opening up, but in a different way from China. And then there are also global milestones alongside the national one, which are more and more dictated by the agenda of the United Nations. So the overlap of the national milestones and the global milestone of the UN have been the elements that are really historically overlapping in the most recent expo that we're trying to present to the visitors. Participation is very broad. Alongside countries and international organizations, we got all sorts of companies, schools, and since Shanghai, we have regions and cities. And on the other side, everybody that you have the United States, the entrepreneurs, all of the people that are part of those entities that help make an expo. But because of the participative nature of expo, everyone is becoming a participant and everyone is a visitor, because that head of state that walks to the expo is himself or herself a visitor. And so when we think about the experience of the expo, at the same time, it's not just the visitors, but it's also the ones that make it, and that those lines are extremely blurred. A few words about the content. This is a very busy slide, but I'm just going to go at a high level and saying that the big heroes are the pavilions and the exhibitions, where countries tell their story in terms of what are they trying to achieve, and where the bulk of the citizen diplomacy takes place in a very substantive way. But it's also in the programming and the cultural shows, but also that programming goes from anything from entertainment to thought leadership, from business meeting to cultural events. And they can be public or private, lots of closed-door meeting, lots of public meeting in the public spaces, large-scale conferences and summit, and very small-scale formats of engagements. Countries celebrate their citizen diplomacy through the national days, where they have the leaders, and certainly in Dubai, that's an example. We put that National Day celebration in the main square, so every visitor there could stop by and listen to the speech from the head of state, and that was then followed by much more informal moments of cultural shows. And then I want to stress the educational components, because more and more schools at all levels are part of the research, they're part of the learning of the expos. So I have just a very few slides here that just say there's been new formats for citizens and engagement that we have tested during Expo 2020 that were very, very participative. Here, it's a stage. What I don't show in this is the other side, where you have the visitors that are very much actively part of this workshop, which we call the World Majlis, that is based on a very traditional Arabic setting of conversation. It was all very, very informal. And I guess that one of the outcomes of COVID to bring in that our, engagement became just like this seminar, online and global, and we had this mixture, and we took those started to take place in the public square and involving students. So that was very, very active of inviting everybody really to discuss the theme of the expos. We brought in the global challenges of the SDGs in a way that, was trying to be very different and bringing people to really understand and engage the SDGs physically, little children to learn all about them, make them, what have you learned? And then actually post it on the expo side. We were recycling things and saying, hey, they were starting to exhibit their own stories. And finally, trying to find different ways of exploring countries. We started to create, the Expo Passport is a big thing for citizens, because you have the passport where you can stamp all of the passport, all of your visits to different countries. But here we also started to say, can we discover the smaller countries through their food, through their games, through their geography, if they're islands, through the type of innovation, through their designs. And we have a series of maps that we're taking visitors in a kind of more playful journey. But nonetheless, now that, quest for the best coffee or quest for the games became playful. And then that is my last slide. The 250 million visits during the 6 months of Expo were actually driven by the virtual Expo, where there was all sorts of content that actually is still living on through, at that time was the live streaming. There are beautiful stories of virtual pavilions actually in Minnesota, where one of the teachers was using them in his classrooms weekly to ask the kids to explore a country in an expo, podcast and Minecraft and all of that. So this is how that big level diplomacy gets played out in the expo side, so that the expo can fulfill its communication role in a way that is really accessible for all of this audience. And that's it for me.
Great.
And we'll take questions later.
Yes, thanks, Federica. Mark, you're last but not least. Oh, you have to unmute.
It's so fun to hear the history and to hear these stories. I have to say, it makes my heart sing. And so I got out my T-shirts. I got my T-shirts from Astana and from Dubai and all the places. But I'm going to talk about this really from the point of view of citizens. We've been mixing this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you are, public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy. And I'm going to be really strict and talk about citizens. And I'm going to talk about citizens diplomacy in the broader context, specifically then about expos, and then about the bid process, because we've been talking about expos that exist. A lot more diplomacy occurs in the bid process, and I'll talk about that. And it is extremely different than the United Nations. It is a secret vote. You don't have big brother, big country with lots of weapons watching over your shoulder to see how you vote. And so I want to stress the citizen part of this. So I had the privilege of growing up at a time when you could do things like create companies that were serving the community. I was involved in this activity in the Bay Area, and we realized that some companies were using disinformation techniques. This is in the 70s to, let's say, create a situation where they would put salespeople in looking like a nurse. And so people would think the nurse knew what they were talking about when they were advocating certain kind of foods that were dangerous. And so we initiated a process of an international boycott on those activities and found ourselves in a hearing in Washington out of the blue, and then found ourselves with Senator Kennedy saying, well, we want to take this to the World Health Organizations. And we go, what's that? And who's that? And all of a sudden, we began a learning process of international policymaking and the role of citizens in that. And out of that came, for me personally, an interest in the hidden, unknown, or ignored history of citizens' involvement in the creation of and operation of our international bodies. I happen to live in Minnesota, where one particular of the founders of the UN was our governor, was a war hero at the same time. And so we were able to meet and talk to the people at the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco, study the organized role of citizens and where they influence those. And it became clear to me that these international institutions, including expos, had a citizen component that was important both in the bid process, that's what I was focused on, and of course, you've heard already wonderful, beautiful examples in the actual hosting of, building, and dismantling of expos. So in a short amount of time, I'll give you a couple specifics about this. The United States, as part of that international competition that we heard about, had a kind of a deep history in expos, but it chose to ignore that. By deep history, I mean that in the first one in 1851 in London, the second one was 1853, 1854 in New York, Some of the most important leaders, thought leaders in America were super involved in London. Horace Greeley, I would highly recommend his books about the London Expo and also about the trade diplomacy of citizens that came out of that. But then he's also a very important chronicler of that expo that was the second one, the one in New York. A Minnesotan who thought that if he went to New York and spoke up about Minnesota, he could convince people to move out to the prairie. 1853, he got the legislature, it was territorial, to give him $300. He took a buffalo, a birch bark canoe, wild rice, and native plants and native foods from Minnesota. Had a wonderful display in New York, got great praise in the New York newspapers and all of that. But he figured out that New Yorkers were not just going to get up and move to Minnesota, but he did notice that tens of thousands of people were coming every week to New York on steamboats. Wrote our governor and said, hey, they're not going to come from New York, but if we put somebody at the ports and we urge them to go to Minnesota, we can grow our state very rapidly. The government of Minnesota put up money for a commissioner of immigration, and that is how Minnesota became who they are today, was out of that initiative. There's a lot to that story, and it's a interesting thing, but it means that our state and our nation have had a deep history in expos. But in the wisdom of Congress and the administration around the year 2000, the thought was, hey, we won the Cold War. We don't need to participate in these expos. And so this was a conscious decision. Colin Powell and others who were in the Secretary of State role would send over to Congress, hey, we want the dues, $24,000 a year, to be part of the international body that was mentioned. The legislature didn't have the guts to actually pass a bill that said we're not going to participate. They used report language, which is a very little known part of the American system that says if the chairman says to you, don't do something, you don't do something. And for 4 years in a row, the chairman said no money to the BIE. And then the fourth year he said, and tell me how you will, and that you have officially withdrawn. So Colin Powell was stuck with being the person who had to withdraw us and walk out on 4 years of unpaid dues. U.S. hates to do that, but we do it. And he said in his memo, I hate to do this, but it takes us off the table for making input into the BIE system. It will cost twice as much to be a participant because that's the rules. And number three, no city in the United States could participate because we weren't a member. And he signed it. So fast forward, a young man who had been our representative in some national debates, who as a boy had been a student from his home country, Venezuela, in their pavilion in Sevilla, moved to Houston, was really interested in expos, began pounding on the State Department like, hey, why don't you rejoin so Houston could host an expo? And he got himself on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. People around the country who shared his desire to see something, San Francisco and Minnesota, Philadelphia, called. We began to meet. Out of those meetings came a process, and out of that process came a political strategy to back the United States into both rejoining the organization so people could do them and getting the dues paid. There were some odd coincidences that I won't go into because of that limited time, but let me just say that in the end of the day, we then became active enough in the process that if we chose to focus the citizens' activities, we could make a big difference in the process. So for instance, Minnesota has a giant diaspora population from all over the planet, really, Asia, Latin America, but Africa especially, and they're highly organized. Minnesota Africans United said, hey, we got a bid coming up for 2027. We're going to talk to the heads of state of every country in Africa. Not all were members, but most were. Not all were paid up in dues. And they did. And something like 80% of the vote that the United States got in the second round of bidding came from Africa. So citizen diplomacy was the thing that worked in that regard. And so these aspects of citizen diplomacy, I would argue they would be great for a day-long seminar someday. But for the moment, just put them as part of the material that you want to be looking at when you're thinking about how can citizens make a difference in the world. I want to end with the story about Minnesota and the virtual, because that teacher loved expos and he was showing them to they were preschoolers, 5-year-olds. And, whiteboard, he was trying to describe it. There were excellent videos that were made and virtual displays. But anyhow, one of the 5-year-olds came up and said, "Let me show you how this works." And he took his finger and he moved the avatar, and the teacher, Mitch, goes, "Whoa, wait a minute. Let's flip the classroom. Let each day they pick a straw, see who's the teacher of the day. They pick the country, they lead the class." And so Mitch got himself on television and newspapers for talking about expos and this. But what was genius about what he did was he was able to recognize that these 5-year-olds could deal with the technology and were hungry for the learning. And he was able to take that into his whole system. That's citizen diplomacy with the future prime ministers, presidents, and leaders of the world. And I'm happy that Minnesota keeps playing a role in that, and grateful for this opportunity to talk more with all of you about these things.
Great, Mark. I can see why you were elected Secretary of State of Minnesota, engaging in your presentation. Really appreciate it. So we are into now the conversation portion of our meeting, and this is where you guys, speaking of kind of giving voice to people, can share questions, comments, et cetera, and so forth. Would love to hear from you. If you could please use your electronic hand. So if you click on the reactions button, and I believe, let me just see here, there should be a hand raised function. I don't actually see it in my list of reactions, but in any case, if you could just raise your hand electronically, that would be helpful if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment.
And I believe there were a couple of questions from Begum from Turkey.
Yes, there are questions in the Zoom chat, and we're going to get to those. Just want to give people the opportunity to raise their hands. Great, Karen, you found the hand raised. Go ahead and please just indicate where you're coming from as well, Karen.
I'm Karen Leggett-Abaraya. I'm in Rockville, Maryland. Mark made a point at the very beginning of his excellent talk, on the difference between public and citizen diplomacy. He actually referenced it, and I'm wondering exactly what is the difference and why is it significant? I mean, what you were talking about was really citizen diplomacy. To me, that's the same as public diplomacy. So if there's a significant difference, perhaps he could explain it. Thank you.
And I'm assuming that's directed at all of our speakers, or?
Oh, it was Mark specifically because he made the comment at the very beginning.
And the national associations that use the title public diplomacy are often people who've worked professionally in diplomacy and are now in another field or retired, and they are very, very knowledgeable typically about the actual sort of foreign ministry or State Department side, and they're engaged in the life of the community. So they make for very interesting. And if folks are especially interested in that, Iowa Public Broadcast has done probably the best single piece on this. It's under public diplomacy, citizen diplomacy. I'd have to look, I'll put it in the chat. But citizen diplomacy is what citizens do. So for instance, Roosevelt, before he died, named different citizen organizations like the AFL, the CIO, the National Congress of Hebrew Women, the National Farmers Union, the American Farm Bureau, as official consultants to the U.S. negotiating delegation, which included someday to be our governor, or was our governor before he went to the military. But those citizens which had the title consultants, played a very important role in a lot of different places. But where they were the most visible, and I would say most impactful, was their absolute insistence that they had to put human rights into the charter. And when the US and Britain refused, the guy representing the CIO union, so that was before its verge, stood up and said, if you don't, we will defeat this just like we defeated the League of Nations in the 20s. And the American Secretary of State turned to the British guy and said, I guess we have to put it in. Thank you. And it shows up in the preamble. And that story got told. Our organization in Minnesota did a retrospect on the 50th anniversary of the UN founding out in the Opera House. And the daughter of Prodiker, there were two kind of key people on international human rights, gave all the details on this and used it to stress why the role of citizens needed to be not hidden, forgotten, or ignored, but elevated. And it really, it was a very inspiring part. So citizens playing a role in establishing relationships, whether it's sister cities or all of that, would be something that would come primarily from the civic or citizen side, not primarily from the State Department, the national government side.
Cesar or Federica, any thoughts on that?
Yes, really quickly. So, Karen, there you will find in the field. I study public diplomacy. I'm in the Center of Public Diplomacy, and we see different groups with different understandings of public diplomacy, citizen diplomacy. So, I agree with what Mark says about citizens getting involved in foreign affairs. My particular view on public diplomacy is diplomats. So actually people accredited by the government engaging with private persons from other sovereign country. So, but in the field, professionals will say that it's more like anyone. I mean, it can be private organizations, can be just private people. So you will have I'm just saying this so you're aware that within the field we're still trying to agree. So you will find different definitions, and just wanted to add that.
Federica?
Well, I'm going to answer as a linguist, which is my background. And it's almost like the ambiguity of citizen diplomacy, which is the diplomacy towards the citizens, which is, in a sense, the main interpretation that I had. But Mark is also talking about the diplomacy by the citizens towards other citizens. And if I think back at, well, first of all, I think one big piece is through the volunteering, because the citizens become advocate of their country also through the specifics of how they interact with people in the expo. I'm going to take some really, really more, less, I'm going to say political examples than more day-to-day in an expo, but certainly in the UAE, the notion of hospitality, of people wanting, an understanding of the culture of the Middle East to be actually unlike the stereotype, and being, a culture that is extremely welcoming, that is extremely opening, that is extremely curious, and also open to discuss all of their own cultural specificity. And the role of volunteers and the kind of pride with whom the volunteers try to interact on the expo side was really a vehicle of the citizens to actually talk to other visitors about their own culture. So that, I think, is a small example, but it's that sense of national pride where people become advocates of their culture, especially when it's, there's their stereotypes, for example, right? Or they're trying to change sort of certain types of perception. And then we can go to some aspects of specific examples when it had to do with sustainability, where, they were people that were advocating citizens, sustainability practices within our own site. So I think we need to allow a little bit for both interpretation, and maybe do a little bit more work on the second interpretation to look for those cases? I think it's a brilliant question, by the way, because gets us, out of the standard interpretation.
And Karen, your question is actually central to the questions I posed, and I think to anybody who's kind of concerned about citizen diplomacy and international exposition. So we're going to get more to this, but I actually so we have the fortune of having Chris McShane with us, who actually teaches a course or has taught a course on citizen diplomacy with us. So and he's chiming in the Zoom chat. But I don't know, Chris, if you want to chime in with regards to this distinction between public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Now there's some good dialogue going on there because it is blurry. But traditionally, public diplomacy is what governments practice going directly to foreign audiences. Traditional diplomacy would be government to government, and public diplomacy would be government to external audiences within another country traditionally. And then citizen diplomacy, again, in a very basic nutshell definition, is people to people outside government organizations. But like somebody just noted, and I fully agree, a lot of citizen diplomacy programs that we would call citizen diplomacy are in fact funded by governments. The U.S. government funds enormous programs that really wind up being from citizen to citizen. So it's blurry. There's a lot of different levels there, but in a nutshell, government to government, government to public audiences, and then people to people, citizen diplomacy.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
I hope that helps. Paul, you know this really
that helps
well
tremendously. And I know you've thought about this and you know how to kind of like summarize it succinctly. So that's why I called on you. Let me take a moment here to actually take a photo of all of us. If you could turn your cameras on. So Nick, Paula, Chuck, Beth, Lisa, Joshua, if you can temporarily at least turn your cameras on, I'd much appreciate it. And if you haven't introduced yourself, by the way, in the Zoom chat, please do so. We'd like to know what city and country you're joining from. So Beth, Lisa, Paula, Chuck, actually, Chuck, I know where you're coming from, but it would be great for you to introduce yourself to everybody else. And Maria Montemayor, likewise, if you could introduce yourselves if you haven't already. And we are going to be getting to your questions. But let me take this photo of everybody. So on 3, if you could smile. 1, 2, 3, smile. And let me take one more shot, just in case there are lots of closed eyes. On 3, if you could smile. 1, 2, 3, smile. Fantastic. Thank you. We are going to go to, speaking of Maria Montemayor, you had a question. Do you want to raise your question? It's about a document, but actually, Federica, I don't know if you also want to share the link to the Dubai 2020 Expo site, because I think it's worth sharing in the Zoom chat if you're willing. But Maria Montemayor, you'll need to mute.
Hi, hello everyone. Yes, just wanted to know if Federica has something published on what she presented today. Thank you.
Unfortunately not. I'm trying to pull it together, but I'm happy to share with you papers that are related to the Expo experience and the evolution. But I'm working more on it right now. I'm also happy to leave you my email with everybody. So if you want to have an offline chat, I looked at your profile and you are interested in architecture and diplomacy. Would be certainly very happy to have a chat afterwards. I'll send the link and my email. I'll put it in the group.
Thank you, Federica.
We also have, I just realized, so Nick Hall is with us, joining us from the University of Southern California. I wonder if you want to either chime in on the presentations actually frozen, so I'm not sure if you can hear us. Or maybe you're not frozen, you're just really.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. And so either comment on, if you would, the presentations. And I know that you've been, because I've enjoyed some of the photos you've shared on Facebook of expos you've been to. I gather you've been to quite a few. So your impressions of expos, perhaps on this question of the difference between public and citizen diplomacy, and whether or not expos are more public diplomacy than citizen diplomacy. And perhaps also to this question of, to the extent that expos are exercises in citizen diplomacy, how does that happen exactly? Mark has given us some indications of that, and I really appreciate it. And actually Federica and Cesar as well. But if you could chime in as well as a historian of public diplomacy, we'd appreciate it.
Well, I think that's very interesting. It's a very interesting question, and it really bears a serious and sustained examination about the relationship between public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy. And I like what's already been said about citizen diplomacy being a distinct thing, but being something that is, to say, used or utilized by public diplomacy. And one thing I've seen myself at expos is how people might start off as being recruited in a public diplomacy effort to act as guides or be part of a particular expo, but then they become something else. They become international people. They start to connect to the expo movement in its own way, and you find. For example, when I went to the Yosu Expo, it was just amazing to meet Spanish people there who had been guides at Seville, now came to be guides at every expo. Now, they're not there to promote Spain. They're there because they feel that expos are important, and it's important that people come to know each other. So I think that the expo becomes kind of like a mechanism for generating some a kind of a transnational civic mindedness, which is a really hopeful thing to encounter. So it may begin as public diplomacy and evolve into something bigger than just the promotion of a particular place or state, like a discovery of the similarities between us. But I think it would be great to have a wider discussion about this, and I think that you've really kind of stumbled into or steered us into maybe a really fertile question. Bruce Gregory's recent book, Diplomacy's Public Dimension, says upfront that it is not about transnational civic interconnection or transnational cultural connection. So he sees citizen diplomacy as being a separate thing that he is not writing about, which I think is an interesting development. So that's sort of what where my thoughts were going, but thanks for calling on me, Paul.
Sure, great. Thanks, Nick, for your perspective. I'd like to turn to Begum Burak, who's joining us from Turkey, because she had a question. Begum, if you're willing to just speak your question, that would be great, rather than me speaking it.
Okay, thank you so much. Actually, I'm not very familiar with these technical terms, but I think Expo, it can also be run by private entities, exhibitions. So if a private enterprise or non-state units can organize such events for the sake of introducing their countries, can this still be counted as a public diplomacy event, or only governments do that? Thank you so much.
I can answer. So the BAE regulates this specific kind of expos, and these are governmental. I mean, governments are deeply involved. This doesn't mean that other kind of exhibitions can happen, international private exhibitions. The BAE doesn't really interfere with that. I don't think they have any interest in regulating that. So that to say that, I mean, there are many kinds of exhibitions. The BIE focuses on this particular type, and also it has a longer history than other kind of exhibitions. In terms of public diplomacy, again, it depends on what definition you take. For some people, whatever a country or an organization does to present their culture abroad, I mean, it counts as public diplomacy. I see it more from the pure diplomatic point of view, as like international law. I take that stance, but so it depends on who you what definition guides you. However, a lot of scholarship out there takes this wider definition. So I would say that most of the scholars would say that some of these exhibitions, private exhibitions, count as public diplomacy.
Thank you so much.
Or Mark, any responses to that question?
Well, I mean, I think I'm trying to describe a part of life that I've been very active in. So expos are huge. The treaty includes horticulture expos, and I'm sure some of them have been privately held, for profit. It includes design biennials, which most of us don't ever talk about, but they're super important to the people in that world, architects who also are very interested in expo. And then different kinds of expos have been around. And so I feel like the bigger the description, the better. But for the purposes of academic work, it's different than, let's say somebody is concerned about if their children have a future on a hot planet and they want to figure out what they can do about it, or if they're fed up with world wars, like our governor was, and they're trying to create an institution for peace. Or Queen Victoria. I mean, go watch Victoria on public broadcast and watch her speeches. There's two sessions of that TV program on the Expo 1851, but her speech is taken from her notes and from the news report, and it's about peace. So, there's, I like as big as we can get. I'm putting into the chat room, there are some books out there about some of these topics that we're not going to be able to get to. But transnational citizen diplomacy and environmental treaty define, there's some great things out there. But they tend to not get much spotlight on them.
Federica?
If I just can clarify something. So yeah, the involvement of citizens is very important and sometimes stronger and more effective than governments. And my highlighting the role of governments is mostly because there are many countries that just don't take these expos seriously. So now we have in the United States an expo unit, and I think that's thanks in good size to, in good measure to Mark Ritchie's effort with Minnesota and all his team. I mean, there's a professional unit right now in the Department of State taking care of this. Canada used to have one, they dismantled it. And it's only very few countries that actually dedicate this government effort to deal with something that's clearly diplomatic. But and I think these governments should be learning also from efforts from citizens. So just to make that, I'm not against, terminology can be, especially in academia, a bit tight, but what's happening outside in the world, it's very strong from the part of citizens.
Federica, any thoughts?
I'm going back to read the question that's on the chat. And just as a clarification, were you actually thinking whether the private companies are holding an expo? Is that what you were referring to? Like private sector companies?
Begum? I'm not sure.
Well, let's assume that that's part of the question. Then, the BIE is very clear, as Cesar was saying, that is really about the non-commercial nature of the expo. And I think there's a whole spectrum because, the expo was inspired by these fairs and then putting together the language of art, with that of innovation to try and promote what was the innovation at the time that was the vision of of Prince Albert. But then out of that, we have the traditional, exhibitions and trade shows. And I think at times the expo actually, in terms of its own brand, struggles to clarify the difference in the general public mind. How is Expo 2020 Dubai, or different from the grand expos at World Trade Center. But I think that when there are no governments, it's certainly a commercial event, right? With a profit, and I'm not going to say it's even PR, because it's just purely for commercial purposes. The expos, the public diplomacy component, is because they're meant to be public, they're meant to be not for profit, and they're meant to involve the government.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a question from Jenna Tooley, and appreciate our interns who are in on this conversation. I do encourage you guys to pose questions. We have about 10 minutes left in our discussion before we get to the end and announcements, including of our citizen diplomacy bulletin. But before we get to Jenna's question, I want to come back to this kind of like this question around public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy, because I think what would be interesting to get for all of you, your sense of things from your quite different perspectives, Federica, Cesar, Mark, and then there are others here who can probably chime in. I don't know if Nick is still with us, but Chris, and I think it's Beth or somebody else who's actually who's at the University of Arizona, and heads some sort of an international exposition unit there. And so would love to get your thoughts on this. But what I'm wondering about is how more authoritarian regimes versus democratic regimes manage this the artifice of kind of creating an image of their country at international expos, because clearly international expos are drawing lots of attention. They are, in essence, more public diplomacy than citizen diplomacy events. In other words, as Chris has pointed out, kind of how governments try to shape the foreign public's views of their country. And so given that they're in more authoritarian countries, there can be constituencies that disagree with the government, but they're less likely to be heard when the government is managing its kind of expo self-presentation. I'm just wondering if you can kind of speak to that difference as you've experienced, as you're aware, between the ways in which more authoritarian regimes and more democratic regimes manage these things. I don't mean to say that democratic regimes are doing things well when it comes to expos or doing things democratically, because governments like the U.S. government have their own agendas. They want to present the United States in a particular way. And this, again, underscores the difference between civil society and governments. And civil society, of course, does not speak with one voice, and it can be in conflict. So with all that said, your thoughts on that difference between authoritarian and democratic regimes and their practice of expositions.
Would you like to take it, Federica, Mark?
Well, I mean, it's hard for me to, my part of this is talking about the bid process. It's so, I like to think about every single member of the BIE being a potential voter for the Minnesota bid. And I don't think about national bids. I actually think that's a misrepresentation of this notion of national bids. But in any case, that means that I want to talk to every government, and my national government doesn't want me talking to about half the government. And so luckily, I'm old enough to have been through enough cycles with my government to be able to say, just because you have this authoritarian view, you can't impose it on me. And I can go out and round up votes from Africa. So, I think about like Hitler's attempt to control the message in the Olympics and how the people of the world had a different agenda than the Nazis. And that was a very interesting moment. Now, it didn't make people stop Hitler. It didn't make the US get, I mean, there are a lot of things it didn't do, but that was an attempt in an mega event of an authoritarian government. So, for me, it is, I was a Secretary of State, and so it's an odd thing to say that, but the origins are the same. Paying attention to the order of how things are done was my responsibility at a state level. And so how this ended up inside the State Department is like a whole nother discussion. But if our State Department is thinking just about what its list is of countries that aren't democratic and therefore we shouldn't talk to, it will make my life more difficult. And I'm interested in making progress in the international arena and people coming to Minnesota, and that's not the interest, let's say, of some other people who want to close the borders or insult people or kill leaders. Mm-hmm. So I'm just thinking about my own government a lot because I was government and now I'm citizen again. And if I think about authoritarian governments, the first thing that comes to mind is mine.
Federica.
Okay, I'm making a lot of notes, and I don't want to say, I think you're probably worth a whole session in itself. But I would actually say, and don't interpret it as a cop-out, but I think that the BIE tries really, really hard, and the organizers as well, not to make the Expo a, let's say, strongly political place. Expos try, while they're doing, carrying out all of this public diplomacy, but there is something that a paper that I would like to share, and I'll send it to you, Mark, and then Paul, and then you can distribute it with everybody. I think the expos are a place where countries are still allowed to dream. They don't go and dream or, exercise the power of imagination when they're sitting in the international organizations. But when they build a pavilion in an expo, that is a slightly different. It's probably the only platform in the world, and that's why I think it's so exciting. And when I think back at the experiences when I was working at the BIE and we were involved with Shanghai, I'm thinking about Milan, and I'm trying to think about, Dubai, Saragossa. So we have a mix of, a whole range of different level of democracy and authoritarian. I feel a lot of similarities because the conversations in the expos, I think the way they the expo tried to remain non-political is through putting such central emphasis on the theme. And the theme is generating very, very robust conversations. And I remember at times, Shanghai was about better city, better life. That was 2010. Certainly China was not having a great reputation of being at the forefront of sustainability. There were very, very robust conversations in the thematic summits between journalists, between experts, and between representatives of the governments. So I feel that, the expo tries to remain a non-confrontational environment because it's by remaining non-confrontational that they can try and push forward some of the dialogues. Now, do you have, in some cases, and it's normally human rights groups that get really upset because in the case of Shanghai, there was a group that wanted to complain because of the site of the expo meant that some residents were going to had to move. And that was part of the regeneration of the city. But was that about the expo per se? The expo was then I'm going to say, a vehicle to get their voice heard, but it was not specifically about the expo. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but the expos tries also to be an environment that gets to the substantive conversation through the team. And all of the governments ultimately, even when they allow themselves to dream and to be provocative, even in their pavilions, they will still do it within, the messaging of the government. So I think that no matter whether you're a democratic country or an authoritarian country, you're still going to try and, stick to those talking points that are actually, practiced, whether you're in a UN summit or, in a World Expo. I think that the presence of the citizens is actually and the theme is actually allowing some of those more substantive conversations to take place.
Mm-hmm.
But they're always non-confrontational. And then I think it's the culture of the Expo.
Great, Federica. It's great to get your perspective. I just want to finish off with these two questions. So one from Jenna Tooley and then the other from Sunny Kim. So Jenna asked, and you guys, Federica, Cesar, and Mark, you can choose to answer one or both, or and if you can do so briefly. So Jenna was asking, how do you believe the role of citizen diplomacy is changing in the context of globalization and the increasing importance of public diplomacy in international relations? So a somewhat complex question there. And Sunny had an interesting question. He said the South Korean president had to apologize for failing to host the 2030, I think, is Expo, and said that South Korea had lost to oil money. How true do you think that money is important in hosting expos or gaining votes? So two different questions.
Well, I can start. I think, yeah, the involvement of citizens becomes stronger and stronger, particularly to the ability to organize through the internet. I think sharing information, organizing, that's allowing people to have more impact. Also, the access to information. I mean, people who really want to know about what's happening in the world, they have access to a more direct, unmediated news and updates about what's happening in the world. So I think that also affects what's happening within diplomacy. So, ministries of foreign affairs are realizing that they have to interact more with the public because they have more impact now. And they have to think about that strategically. So that's regarding the first question. The second one, so as I believe Mark mentioned, the BIE, one piece where they are different, the UN is about the vote, secret ballot. So what has been happening, and I have heard of some efforts to try and change this, is that a country can promise the vote to any one or more candidates. I mean, because in the end, nobody's not going to know who voted for whom. So it's a system. I don't know any information to say that it has been corrupted, but I think the way it exists, it can be. I mean, you never know if a delegate accepts money to vote secretly for a country other than what their own country ordered. I don't know. I mean, it's just a supposition, an assumption. So if this was an open vote, it would be easier to do this diplomatically through diplomatic agreements. Money has to do, I believe it does. I mean, Saudi Arabia invested a lot of money in airport for Riyadh 2030, but so did South Korea. And I mean, I think it was a very close competition in terms of promotion. They left out Rome. I think Rome was a very important city to host an expo, but they didn't have the funds. So I think it's worth discussing and worth focusing on that diplomatic effort, especially if the U.S. Countries like the U.S. that are not investing that much money want to host an expo, because if they cannot have that certainty that they're going to get votes, it's a lot of effort that might be going to waste.
Federica?
Yeah, I think that I'll answer sort of the second question. And it's very true that the secret ballot for the BIE is potentially problematic, but I think it's a bigger conversation to say what are the repercussions on making it transparent. If we think about South Korea, and I've been quite involved with the Saudi Arabia bid, which has been a way for myself to actually educate myself on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, even though we sort of live next door. And a couple of comments on that. If you think about South Korea, Busan, it's probably less than 600 kilometers from Osaka. So if you think about countries that are also having an expo in 2025 in Japan, and then another that it's a few hundred kilometers just across the sea into South Korea, I don't think that it's a lot of public diplomacy for them. In a way, it's actually, it's quite restrictive, right? Why do countries participate in an expo? And irrespective of whether somebody is going to take a bag of money from somebody else, that goes down to the individual. But the conversation that have to do with the votes, yes, every country will say, what's in it for me? And what's in it for them? It's foreign direct investment. It's opening up to a market. It's opportunity for the next 30 years, or 50. So that's why everybody wanted to be in China. There was no country that was not going to be in China. And in this bid, for me, as more or less of an outsider, was very, very easy. Because where do you want to be in 2030 with the biggest market that opening up at an incredible speed? And the countries that will go in will have incredible access to a huge market that's opening up, plus the connection to Saudi Arabia with a very highly diversified economy. Now, they talk about oil money, that's probably oil money, but Saudi Arabia is diversifying across entertainment, technology, energy, food security, you name it. There's an industry, there's a space. So I think that the argument really here is who had the biggest story in terms of what's in it for me in the next 3 decades. That where the expo, it's what you do and you obtain in the build up to the expo, what you cement in spending 6 months there, and how long do you stay afterwards, having built those relationships at the highest level of government and companies.
Mark, you got the last word, if you can be brief, because we've got to get to announcements, including our citizen diplomacy bulletin.
I think the globalization of citizen activity, and I put a couple books in the chat about this, but really kicked off around the era of slavery in the 1850s, and now it's big time. And in this moment, one of the things that's happening is the sort of re-engagement of some governments like the US, which had dropped out and stuff like that, but it's the super engagement of citizens, one, who've been scattered over the planet as recent refugees, and the second as diasporas, which are all over the planet, who are organized in strong body. So within the United States and within Minnesota, you can feel that there are people who are from a country and are living in another country and maybe have moved to a third country, but they are partisans about each place in their journey. They are wanting to be helpful in their own lives, their family, their community, and in their home countries. And so you have this well of energy, human capacity, wanting to make life better where they are and where they come from. And if political leaders can't figure out that that's not something to try to mow down with machine guns, but that's something to embrace and to say, come on over to an expo and let's do A, B, and C, then we will deserve the hot, the dry, the unpredictable, the flood, the biblical level things that apparently have happened in the past because people weren't honoring a certain kind of respect of others. Maybe we can do a better job by being aware, using the expos as an organizing moment. I think of the bids as an organizing moment. But the second question obviously refers to some things that are hard. You know, I've lost several bids, but we're going to do something in 2031 because we think it's that important.
Great. Thanks to the three of you and to everybody for what was really a rich conversation about expos. I want to turn now to Brian Smith, who's my co-editor for the CD Bulletin. And with every meeting of this CDI, we produce a bulletin which we share with you at this meeting, and then we also share online afterwards. So you will get a physical, or an electronic rather, copy of this as well. Brian, I'm going to share my screen, and you can speak speak to the issue.
All right, thanks, Paul. So yes, thank you for those great presentations and discussion. There was quite a few points of contact between the conversation and the bulletin here. I did want to start. So this first event here is a joint Israeli-Palestinian Memorial Day service, and I think it actually does sort of show somewhat of the distinction between public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy in a way. You know, most Memorial Day or national holidays within countries are government-based events geared towards the public in a way, but this is an event that's been taking place for 19 years now in Israel. That's a joint Memorial Day service led by a civil society organization called Combatants for Peace and the Parent Circle Family Forum that actually brings citizens, former combatants, bereaved parents, and thousands of supporters who are basically looking for a resolution to that conflict, and peace building events like this are gaining in. It's a tough moment, of course, now, but there's still a lot of activity within these places where citizens are coming together outside of government organizations to express their hope for better understanding and peace. I also, so Federica mentioned Osaka is in fact the site of the next World Expo. It's in 2025. And I wanted to highlight this because there's actually a part of the turn towards from the Bureau of Expositions away from just trade shows to cultural exchange, and now they are focusing a lot on resolving social issues and global issues. And so I did want to bring to your attention. There are you can propose a project for the World's Fair as a citizen group, as a private organization, to address the big global issues of the day. And you can follow these links and get information. The projects can still be proposed. It's kind of tight. It's up till June 19th. But if you're interested in having your work presented at the expo itself, please do look into that possibility. And then the other thing Mark mentioned was this Iowa Public PBS in America is the public broadcasting service, but it's a video a film that was made, a documentary on citizen diplomacy that was done in Iowa. It's a fascinating watch, and I recommend it. Paul actually spoke at an event about learning life and citizen diplomacy international at this event that was held by the Public Diplomacy Council of America. So check that out. Another big international meeting of the G7 is happening in Rome. It happened, excuse me, and you can see some of there's all these different civil society organizations that have come together and are really pushing a civil society agenda at these big multilateral international meetings. So that's a important development that people should definitely take a look at. Just a couple other events for young diplomats coming up. the Global Diplomatic Forum, and then CISB International. And then go on down and you'll see some recent publications. Definitely look into the ones that Mark shared and others. I believe it was Nick Cole that mentioned on down, there's this great new book by Bruce Gregory about American public diplomacy, and that's listed in our recent books, and just lots of great resources that are available for people who are interested in citizen diplomacy, public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, et cetera, all the different shades of diplomacy that are really proliferating today. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. Oops. Sorry about that. I was trying to find where I was here. Thank you, Brian, for that, and really appreciate you. Actually, you largely put this thing together. I just provide feedback on the CD bulletin. Any other announcements before we end?
Paul, may I make an invitation?
Yes.
2 things. I'm going to add this to the chat. So if you want to learn more about Expos, you mentioned the Institute for the Study of International Expositions. That's a group that is led by Lisa Schrank at the University of Arizona. So there's a link. And on June 17th, we're having an online event with the Department of State, with the Office of the Undersecretary for Public Affairs, on the future of public diplomacy. So there's a link if you want to join. It's free. It's online, June 17th. So thank you.
Fantastic. Any other announcements? All right. If there are no other announcements, want to thank you guys again, our presenters, and to all participants for chiming in, whether you did spoken or in the Zoom chat. Our next meeting, just FYI, is on digital diplomacy on Wednesday, September 4th at 12 to 1:30 p.m. So you will get notice of it if you're on our email list. If you're not on our email list, the Zoom, the information I provided early on provides you a way to get into our email list so that you can get invitations to these quarterly meetings. The last meeting of the year is on December 3rd, and it's on careers in citizen diplomacy, or possibly agricultural diplomacy. We haven't decided as yet, but that's that. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for your time, and see you in September, hopefully. Bye, everyone.
Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you.